Hey guys, tonight we travel far beyond what the textbooks tell us. Beneath the sun-scorched plateau of Giza, beneath layers of neatly curated history. Our journey begins not above ground, where tourists gather and cameras click, but in the darkness below. A place where the silence is older than the sand. So, if you feel comfortable watching the video, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you really like what I do here. And as always, I'd love to know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is there. Now then, turn off the lights. Maybe turn on the fan to enjoy the journey tonight. Beneath the shimmering heat waves of the Egyptian desert lies something unexpected. Not tombs, not gold, but silence, broken only by the low mechanical hum of seismic instruments and the breath of researchers who dare to question what they were taught. In the early 1990s, a geophysical survey team led by Thomas Dobecki and John Anthony West conducted a seismic scan around the base of the Great Sphinx. Their intent was modest: to better understand the subsurface composition for conservation. But the data they retrieved changed everything. Beneath the Sphinx, they recorded a series of rectangular anomalies, patterns that didn't resemble natural formations. They resembled chambers. But chambers to what? Egypt's Supreme Council of Antiquities quickly dismissed the findings. The official narrative remained intact. The pyramids and Sphinx were constructed around 2500 BCE by the Old Kingdom pharaohs, but the instruments had spoken otherwise. The silence beneath the sand had cracked. It wasn't just the Sphinx. Later scans of the Giza Plateau revealed voids beneath the Great Pyramid itself, long corridors, empty shafts, unexplored cavities. In 2017, a team using muon detection technology, particles from cosmic rays, confirmed the existence of a 30-meter-long void above the Grand Gallery. It was called the Big Void. Still, no one is allowed to enter it. Why? The official answer: we don't want to damage the structure. A fair concern, perhaps. Yet, for something supposedly built by Khufu as a tomb, the pyramid's internal configuration remains shockingly inaccessible. No wall inscriptions, no mummy, no funerary goods. Only blank, monumental stone. The ancient builders left no clear sign they ever existed. Archaeologists who toe the party line claim the pyramids were built in about 20 years by tens of thousands of laborers. Yet even with modern machinery, we struggle to move, much less place, such massive stones with the precision the Great Pyramid displays. And then there's the fact that not a single tool, plan, or diagram has ever been found near the site. Still, the mainstream remains firm. It was human effort, organized brilliance, and early mathematics, a feat of civilization. But what if it wasn't? Because buried in old travel logs, dusty journals, and fringe oral histories are mentions of rooms of records hidden beneath the sand. Stories of an ancient library, predating even the Library of Alexandria, that stores the knowledge of a civilization lost before history began. Plato called it Atlantis. The Egyptians called it Zep Tepi, the first time. Some even whisper that Napoleon, during his 1798 campaign in Egypt, spent a mysterious night alone inside the Great Pyramid. He never spoke of what happened, only that you would not believe me if I told you. Could it be that long before the dynastic Egyptians rose to prominence, they inherited something already ancient? That the pyramids and the Sphinx were not theirs to build, but to guard. This is not a new idea. In fact, old Egyptian priests told the Greek historian Herodotus that their civilization went back over 13,000 years. Herodotus, who visited Egypt in the 5th century BCE, was told of generations before generations, of cataclysms and rebirths, of records kept in stone beneath the sacred sands, records that no one seems eager to uncover. In 1996, Egyptologist Zahi Hawass and American mystic Edgar Cayce's foundation clashed over attempts to excavate beneath the Sphinx. Cayce had predicted that a hall of records would be found there, chronicling an ancient, pre-cataclysmic civilization. Despite widespread interest, all such excavations were blocked. The official reasoning? There is nothing to be found. But one must ask, how can we be so sure when we refuse to look? To this day, parts of the Giza Plateau remain off-limits. Sealed entrances, bricked-over shafts, guarded stairwells leading to nowhere. In 2020, satellite imagery revealed suspicious indentations on the Western Plateau. Perfectly square shadows, consistent with buried structures. Yet no official statement was ever released. If these chambers exist, if they truly hold secrets from before the known pharaohs, then what version of history are we preserving? And why are we so afraid to disturb the silence beneath the sand? Because maybe, just maybe, if the truth is ever brought into light, the story of who built the pyramids will not begin in Egypt at all. It will begin in a time we've forgotten, or were made to forget. And that's where we go next. The sun rises slowly over Giza, casting long shadows across limestone. But while tourists marvel at the symmetry of the Great Pyramid steps, few pause to wonder, how were they lifted into place at all? Each block, on average, weighs 2.5 tons. The heaviest, those deep within the king's chamber, weigh nearly 80 tons. These were hauled from Aswan, over 500 miles to the south. By boat, they say. Then dragged across the desert sands, they say. Then somehow lifted dozens of meters into the sky. Copper chisels and rope, that's the official story. Yet, not a single copper chisel used in pyramid construction has been found in or near Giza. And those we do have, from nearby quarries, are incapable of cutting granite. Tests done by modern engineers show copper bends and dulls almost instantly when used on hard stone like granite or basalt. Even if sharpened repeatedly, the time and labor would be astronomical. So what did they use? Some point to ancient depictions of curious tools, handheld rods, fork-like devices, shown in temples far from the pyramids. Mainstream Egyptologists wave these away as symbolic, ritualistic, decorative. But fringe theorists see something else. They ask, could the ancient Egyptians have possessed a form of acoustic levitation? It sounds absurd at first, but there is precedent, at least anecdotal. In the early 20th century, a Swedish doctor named Jarl visited Tibet and claimed to have witnessed monks levitating massive stones using sound, chanting, and drums aimed precisely at the boulders. The stones floated, he said, and settled into place high up on mountain cliffs. His story was dismissed as fantasy. No proof, no repeatable experiment. But what if it wasn't fantasy? The king's chamber, deep within the Great Pyramid, was constructed using rose granite transported from hundreds of miles away. The stones are fitted so tightly that not even a sheet of paper can pass between them. There is no mortar, no adhesive, only precision and sound. Modern acoustic engineers have studied the chamber and found it resonates at exactly 432 hertz. That's a frequency found in some ancient musical scales and believed by mystics to be in harmony with the natural world. Coincidence? Perhaps. But the precision of the Great Pyramid doesn't stop with its internal structure. The base is almost perfectly level, within 0.6 inches across its 13-acre span. Its sides are aligned almost exactly with the cardinal points of the compass. Modern GPS data confirms this, suggesting a surveying accuracy beyond anything we thought ancient people capable of. And the entire structure is mathematically encoded. The ratio of the pyramid's height to its base circumference reflects pi. The golden ratio is also embedded in its dimensions. The slope of its faces mirrors the angle formed by a right triangle with sides in the Fibonacci sequence. No blueprints have ever been found, no workshop ruins, no drawings or rough models. So how did they build it? One theory that hovers at the edge of acceptability is that the Great Pyramid was not built block by block at all, but poured. Enter the geopolymer theory. French materials scientist Joseph Davidovits has argued that many of the blocks in the pyramid are not quarried stone, but a type of synthetic limestone, ancient concrete. He claims to have reproduced the mixture: limestone, kaolinite clay, nitron, and water, and demonstrated how it could be cast into molds. His theory explains the lack of tool marks. It explains the precise fit. It even explains the presence of trapped air bubbles and anomalous chemical signatures found in some blocks. But Egyptologists dismiss him. Why? Because no mixing stations, molds, or casting equipment have been found, and because the idea simply doesn't fit the accepted narrative. Yet, what if we're wrong? What if the reason the pyramid defies explanation is because we are applying the wrong lens? Modern architects and engineers, from MIT to structural firms in Tokyo, have attempted to replicate the pyramid's construction. The consensus: we could do it barely, but only with cranes, computers, and months of digital modeling. Ancient Egypt, we are told, had none of those things. Then how do we account for the internal shafts within the pyramid that align with the stars, particularly Orion's belt and Sirius, at a time thousands of years before Khufu's reign? To do this would have required not just architectural skill, but astronomical knowledge and measurement tools that officially didn't exist yet. So here's the puzzle. We have a 6 million-ton monument built with an impossible level of precision, using unknown methods, without blueprints, tools, or prototypes, and no evidence of practice attempts elsewhere. Who builds something like that? Perfectly, on the first try. Even the most devout academic minds concede this much. We don't fully understand how the Great Pyramid was built. The techniques remain, in their words, uncertain. But those who whisper more freely believe the answer lies not in what the Egyptians could do, but in what someone else left behind for them to guard. By night, the desert changes. The heat dies, the sky sharpens, and the stars emerge, clear, ancient, and unmoved. For millennia, these constellations watched in silence as civilizations rose and fell. But one cluster of stars has always drawn particular attention: Orion's belt. And the pyramids seem to have noticed too. At first glance, the connection appears coincidental, but when viewed from above, something startling emerges. The three pyramids of Giza mirror, with eerie precision, the three main stars of Orion's belt: Alnitak, Alnilam, and Mintaka. The alignment is not perfect by modern standards, but it is uncannily close for a civilization that supposedly used nothing more than the naked eye. In 1994, Belgian engineer Robert Bouval published The Orion Mystery, proposing that the layout of the Giza pyramids was intentional, meant to reflect a stellar blueprint drawn in stone. He argued that the ancient Egyptians associated Orion with Osiris, the god of the afterlife, and that the pyramids served as gateways to the stars. Mainstream archaeology did not take kindly to the idea. Critics called it astro-mysticism, brushing it aside as numerology dressed in sandstone. But one detail proved harder to dismiss. When Bauval extended his model beyond architecture and into astronomy, he realized that the alignment of the pyramids and Orion's belt was most accurate. Not in 2500 BCE, when the pyramids were supposedly built, but in 10,500 BCE. Why would the builders choose that date? They couldn't have known about the precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble of Earth's axis that causes the stars to drift gradually over time, unless they had either advanced sky mapping knowledge or had access to records from someone who did. This is where things deepen. Because 10,500 BCE is also the approximate date Plato gives for the destruction of Atlantis. It's the end of the last ice age, the rise of agriculture, and to some researchers, the re-emergence of survivors from a global cataclysm. What if the pyramids were not constructed in 2500 BCE, but restored then? What if they were already ancient by Khufu's time? The Egyptian priest Manetho, writing in the 3rd century BCE, recorded that the civilization of Egypt stretched back over 36,000 years. While his timelines were considered fanciful by later scholars, some researchers now revisit them with new interest, especially in light of newly discovered pre-dynastic artifacts and structures buried beneath layers of Nile silt. Even the ancient texts hint at lost knowledge. The pyramid texts, etched into the walls of Saqqara tombs, speak not of death, but of ascent, of the soul transforming into a star, of ascending to Orion. So, are the pyramids simply monuments, or were they machines? Bauval wasn't alone in suspecting a deeper function. Engineers have noted the Grand Gallery of the Great Pyramid is oddly shaped, far taller than necessary for human passage. It's angled like a telescope. Some have suggested it once held a mechanism, a device to mark a precise stellar conjunction, or more strangely, to harness it. If the pyramid was designed to tune in to Orion, then it might have functioned like a resonator, an instrument vibrating in harmony with the sky. And that idea brings us back to myth. Because in the Book of the Dead, the soul of the deceased is guided by Anubis to follow the ways of the stars. These weren't just metaphors. The Egyptians believed that to live again in the afterlife, one had to reach the Duat, the hidden realm among the stars. And the Duat? Its entry point was Orion. Why else would the narrow shafts in the Great Pyramid, far too small for humans, be aimed precisely at the Orion constellation and the star Sirius? Why carve such channels into a tomb? Unless the journey they offered was not physical, but spiritual, energetic, or communicative. Still, the official narrative resists. To accept that the pyramids were aligned to Orion in 10,500 BCE means accepting they were designed by someone who understood the precession cycle, something not officially discovered until Hipparchus in 150 BCE, unless someone had known all along. Ancient Zep-Tepi myths tell of a time when gods walked among men and the Nile flowed in reverse, a time before time, when the stars ruled Egypt. Could these stories be memories? Fractured, remythologized memories of something that truly occurred in deep antiquity? Because what we find, again and again, is this. The deeper we look at the pyramids, the older they seem. The more we map them to the heavens, the less they resemble tombs. Perhaps they were never meant to house the dead. Perhaps they were meant to call to the stars. The Sphinx sits not in grandeur, but in silence. Its ancient face weathered, its body partly buried by the very sands it has outlasted. For centuries, it was dismissed as a companion piece to the pyramids, assumed to be carved under Pharaoh Khafre's reign around 2500 BCE. But then came the rain, or rather, the evidence of it. In the early 1990s, geologist Dr. Robert Schoch from Boston University visited Giza at the request of John Anthony West. West, a maverick researcher, believed the Sphinx was far older than traditional Egyptology claimed. Schoch was skeptical until he examined the erosion. What he saw startled him. The deep, undulating fissures on the Sphinx's enclosure walls weren't the result of mere wind and sand. They had the signature of sustained vertical rainfall, rain that would have required thousands of years, and a climate radically different from today's parched desert. But Egypt hasn't experienced such prolonged heavy rainfall since at least 7,000 to 9,000 years ago. Maybe more. This meant the body of the Sphinx, if not its recarved face, could date back to before 7000 BCE. That's twice as old as the accepted timeline for the monument. Schoch's findings ignited a firestorm. Egyptologists scoffed. They insisted the Sphinx must match the era of nearby temples and statues bearing Khafre's likeness. But Schoch's rebuttal was simple. Let the stone speak. The limestone surrounding the Sphinx showed rounded fluting, typical of water weathering, not wind. In contrast, nearby tombs carved later show crisp, angular erosion, matching the dry climate of the dynastic period. If the erosion was from rain, the Sphinx predates the desert itself. And that, perhaps, is the most troubling idea of all. Because if the Sphinx was built before the desert, before the Old Kingdom, then who built it? Not Khafre, not even Narmer, Egypt's first pharaoh, but someone before them. Someone unknown. The Sphinx's head is also disproportionately small for its body. Most scholars agree it was recarved, perhaps more than once. Some suggest it originally bore the head of a lion, or something not human at all. This adds weight to the idea that the body is vastly older than the current face. And then there are the granite blocks of the Sphinx temple nearby. Megalithic stones weighing up to 200 tons, placed with a precision that defies explanation. They show signs of erosion too. Erosion consistent with the same wet climate. This wasn't just a statue. It was a site. A sacred complex, built during a time when the Nile Valley was lush, green, and unrecorded. It's tempting to believe this older civilization was wiped away by rising sands or rising seas. After all, the last ice age ended around 10,500 BCE, unleashing massive floods and climate upheaval. Many oral traditions speak of a great deluge, Mesopotamian, biblical, Hindu, all telling of a world reset. Could the Sphinx be the last sentinel of that forgotten age? There are echoes of this idea in Egyptian mythology. The Zep Tepi, or first time, was an era when the gods ruled the earth, before the pharaohs, before chaos, a golden age. Perhaps the Sphinx is not a monument, but a marker, pointing back to that era. Its gaze is not idle. It faces due east, watching the rising sun on the spring equinox, a symbol of rebirth, resurrection, renewal. In 10,500 BCE, that sunrise would have appeared directly in line with the constellation Leo, the lion. The same creature the Sphinx may have once resembled. Coincidence again? Or a celestial time capsule encoded in stone? Mainstream Egyptology prefers not to answer. They dismiss the water erosion as a geological anomaly. They cite tradition rather than investigation. But others, archaeologists at the fringe, continue to ask, what if the Sphinx is not just older than we thought, but older than we remember? What if it's the voice of a civilization that spoke in stone, and time has muffled its language beneath the weight of sand? And if the Sphinx was meant to endure, what message did it hope we'd one day rediscover? We turn now from its silent gaze to something buried even deeper. Not in stone, but in stories. The wind whispers softly across the plateau at dusk, drawing long lines through the sand as if attempting to erase something ancient, something deliberately buried. Beneath the temples, beneath the tombs, beneath the recorded reigns of kings. Archaeologists have found traces, not of gold or jewels, but of questions etched in granite. Deep beneath the temple of Seti, the wine in Abydos, lies something astonishing: the Osirian. Unlike the delicate carvings of Seti's mortuary temple above, the Osirion is stark, megalithic. Immense granite blocks form corridors and chambers without ornamentation. Each block weighs dozens of tons and is cut with an accuracy that rivals modern machining. But here's the mystery. It's lower than the surrounding architecture, wetter, and seemingly much older. The pharaohs of the New Kingdom would have needed to dig down into the ground just to build beside it. Why would they do that, unless the Osirion was already there? Mainstream scholars suggest it was simply an architectural choice, a stylistic anomaly. But other researchers, like Graham Hancock and Robert Bauval, suggest something more daring. That the Osirion wasn't a temple of the gods. It was a relic from the gods, or at least from those who came before. Even ancient Egyptian inscriptions acknowledge this possibility. In the Turin King List, one of Egypt's most important ancient texts, there are entire dynasties of Shemsu-Hor, or companions of Horus, listed as reigning before the first human pharaoh. They are said to have ruled for thousands of years, not decades, not centuries, millennia. And the Palermo stone, another fragmentary record, lists kings who ruled when Egypt was in the sky, an era of celestial governance. Modern scholars interpret these as myth, but when matched against other records, from Mesopotamia, India, and even Central America, a pattern appears. Ancient kings who lived impossibly long lives, civilizations that rose quickly and fell even faster. And then, silence. Could it be that what we now call myth was once a fractured memory of real events? The deeper excavations go in Egypt, the stranger the finds become. Beneath the step pyramid of Djoser lies a massive labyrinth of shafts, chambers, and storage rooms. Over 11 kilometers of subterranean construction. This was supposedly the first pyramid, but the complexity below ground suggests a far older origin. Even stranger are the boxes of Serapeum at Saqqara. Enormous granite sarcophagi, each weighing up to 70 tons, are housed in long tunnels carved into the bedrock. They were once thought to hold the sacred bulls of Apis, but few contain any remains at all. And again, no one knows how these massive containers were made or moved. Laser scanning of their interiors shows that the surfaces are machined to tolerances within a fraction of a millimeter. With what tools? Copper chisels? Wooden sleds? One engineer stated plainly, "We would struggle to replicate this today, even with advanced equipment." So who did it? Who were these pre-dynastic masons, these ghost builders of stone who left behind no bodies, no names, only megaliths? Some point to the Neolithic cultures along the Nile. But their surviving artifacts, crude pottery, simple flint tools, do not reflect the complexity of the structures above them. It's as if the technology devolved over time, not advanced. It's a historical paradox. The earliest architecture is the most precise, and that paradox isn't limited to Egypt. In Peru, at sites like Sacsayhuaman, the oldest walls show the most advanced stonework, giant blocks fitted so tightly that even seismic shifts have failed to disturb them. Later Incan additions, by contrast, are rough, sloppy, and poorly aligned. What if this pattern holds in Giza as well? What if the pyramid complex was inherited? Its knowledge handed down like a relic too powerful to understand, too sacred to alter? Perhaps the early pharaohs did not build the pyramids to demonstrate power, but to align themselves with power, to stake their reigns upon a lineage older than history, a lineage now lost. Some scholars, cautiously, refer to a lost dynasty, a cultural phase with no name, no records, but whose stonework whispers of incredible knowledge. Others go further, speaking of civilizations erased by cataclysm, remembered only in myth. A golden age, shattered by flood or fire, its survivors scattering knowledge like seeds on the wind. Could the architects of the Great Pyramid be among them? Could the Sphinx, the Osirion, the uncarved blocks beneath Saqqara, all be remnants of a forgotten people whose name we no longer even speak? Maybe they were never forgotten. Maybe they were deliberately buried. And perhaps, if we wish to know what they knew, we must stop asking when Egypt began and begin asking what came before. Beneath the Nile Valley, near the oasis town of Fayoum, lies the crumbled ghost of something monumental, something that once dwarfed even the pyramids in complexity and scope. The ancient Greeks called it the labyrinth, and in their writings, it stood not as myth, but as memory. Herodotus, the father of history, visited Egypt around 450 BCE. What he saw at Hawara left him in awe. He described a vast complex of interconnected chambers, over 3,000 rooms, half above ground and half beneath, so intricate and immense that he claimed it surpassed even the pyramids. Strabo, the Roman geographer, wrote of a structure so immense that its roofs were carved from single slabs of stone. Pliny the Elder added that kings had tried to imitate it, but none could match its scale. So what happened to it? Modern Egyptologists point to a pile of ruins at Hawara, near the pyramid of Amenemhat III. To them, this broken foundation is all that remains, a collapsed mortuary temple of modest ambition. But aerial surveys and ground-penetrating radar suggest otherwise. In 2008, a team from the Mataha expedition, comprising Egyptian researchers and Belgian scientists, conducted a radar scan of the area. What they found shocked them. Beneath the sand lay a geometric grid of cavities, tunnels, and hollow chambers. The data, they claimed, matched ancient descriptions of the labyrinth. But when they submitted their report to the Egyptian authorities, silence. Their findings were never published in academic journals. Access was denied. Why? The question hangs in the air like desert dust. Could it be that buried beneath Hawara is not merely a forgotten temple, but a record hall? A literal labyrinth of stone containing knowledge from before the dynastic age? Herodotus claimed that every chamber was filled with hieroglyphs and carvings, histories of Egypt from the earliest times, not just royal records, cosmic records, myths carved in stone, not parchment, stories of gods descending from the sky, of floods and stars and fire, of a world that existed before ours. In some versions of the story, the labyrinth housed a book of Thoth, a legendary text said to contain the secrets of the heavens, the movements of the stars, and even the means of immortality. That book, according to certain Hermetic traditions, was hidden away by ancient priests during the collapse of the first time. And where better to conceal it than in a maze beneath the earth? Some fringe researchers believe the labyrinth was more than an archive. They suggest it was a machine, a giant harmonic resonator, a complex temple that once harnessed Earth's natural energies. They cite the choice of location, aligned with subtle magnetic anomalies. They point to other subterranean complexes in Egypt, all centered near water tables and fault lines. The idea? That these ancient builders understood how to interact with planetary energy systems long before the concept of a power grid ever existed. It's an idea easy to dismiss until you look again at the Giza Plateau. The Great Pyramid stands over a network of subterranean shafts and channels. Beneath it is the so-called pit chamber, carved deep into the bedrock. Some have likened it to a tuning chamber. Others say it was part of an energy device. What if these underground components weren't tombs, but conduits? What if they were all part of something greater? A planetary temple network, with Hawara as its heart. It's notable that the Great Pyramid and the Labyrinth sit on different ley line intersections, geodetic points said to channel Earth's magnetic field. Pure myth to most scientists, but a subject of serious study in ancient cultures. And then there's the silence. The site at Hawara is not open for deep excavation. Requests to dig further are denied. The ruins are collapsing under groundwater seepage with little attempt at preservation. Could it be because what lies beneath threatens the timeline we've built? Could it house texts that speak of gods who ruled before men? Civilizations that fell not to war, but to skyborne catastrophe? Or is it simply too vast, too strange, too ancient for our current frameworks to handle? As with the Sphinx and the voids beneath Giza, the answers lie just below our feet. But for now they remain untouched. And so the labyrinth waits, beneath the sands, beneath the lies, beneath the forgotten years, waiting perhaps for those who still listen to the voices of stone. Stone whispers, not with sound, but with weight, shape, and grain. And the stones at the heart of the Great Pyramid whisper louder than most. They are not the smooth, visible outer casings that once gleamed white in the sun. Those have long since been stripped away. No, these are the hidden stones, buried deep inside, where only time and the occasional robot can reach. They are called the core blocks, and they don't match the story. Cut roughly and fitted with seeming carelessness, the core blocks are often overlooked. Egyptologists point to them as evidence that the pyramid was built from the inside out, layer by layer, a triumph of logistics over aesthetics. But the deeper researchers go, the stranger these blocks become. Some are unusually porous. Others seem to have tiny air bubbles, trapped gas, almost as if they were not quarried, but cast. That's where the geopolymer theory resurfaces. Joseph Davidovits, the same material scientist who suggested the pyramids may have been made of early concrete, believes these core blocks are synthetic. His lab tests on small samples indicated the presence of minerals that don't naturally occur together in Egyptian limestone. More tellingly, the microstructure of the stone appeared amorphous, not the result of compression over millions of years, but of rapid setting. He proposed a recipe: limestone rubble dissolved in water and mixed with natron, sodium carbonate, and lime. Poured into wooden molds, it would harden into durable stone. In other words, The blocks weren't carved, they were poured. Such a method would explain the strange fitting, where some blocks curve or bend into place in ways that carved stone typically cannot. It would also explain how a civilization lacking cranes could lift blocks weighing many tons by not lifting them at all. But then comes the resistance. Egyptologists reject the geopolymer theory outright. Why? They say there's no ancient text describing this method, no tools, no molds, no mixing pits. But is that reason enough to discard it entirely? Because ancient Egypt left few engineering manuals behind. They carved prayers into temple walls, but not construction instructions. And if such a technique were a closely guarded secret, one known only to priest architects or temple engineers, would they have written it down for all to see? The ancient world often treated knowledge as sacred, esoteric, hidden. Some modern engineers have tested Davidovit's theory with promising results. They've created blocks indistinguishable from natural limestone to the naked eye. Yet their findings are rarely welcomed in Egyptological circles. Could it be because the implications are too disruptive? Because if even some of the pyramid's blocks were man-made, then the idea of a monolithic construction effort using only brute force begins to unravel. It would also explain something else. The absence of quarry scars. Yes, the nearby Tura and Mokattam quarries provided casing stones. But for the millions of internal blocks, there's scant evidence of large-scale extraction. Where are the chisel marks? The tool fragments? The broken attempts? A structure of such scale should have left chaos in its wake. Debris fields, broken stones, abandoned cuts. But we find silence. And then, there are the magnetic anomalies. Several studies using magnetometers around the Great Pyramid have detected minor but inexplicable fluctuations, almost as if some of the internal blocks respond to geomagnetic activity differently than natural limestone should. If true, it suggests a kind of mineral manipulation, a deliberate engineering of the stone's internal properties. Some have even proposed that the pyramid was designed to conduct or resonate with Earth's energy fields, especially if certain blocks were doped with trace metals or crystalline structures during casting. That might explain why the king's chamber contains granite blocks with a high quartz content. Quartz is piezoelectric, meaning it generates an electrical charge under pressure. Was this coincidence? Or were the builders aware? Once again, we return to that whisper in stone. Because the core blocks, the ones no tourist sees, are not uniform. Some seem almost melted at the edges. Others have embedded fossils, upside down, suggesting the mixture was churned and reset. This shouldn't be possible with quarried stone, but it's precisely what would happen with poured material. So maybe the pyramid was not an immovable stack of boulders, but a carefully layered monolith cast from knowledge we no longer possess. A recipe older than writing, a chemistry lost in the sand, a secret not erased, but petrified. And if these core blocks are synthetic, then the pyramid is not just a monument. It's technology. Beneath the apex of the Great Pyramid lies a chamber that defies expectation. Known simply as the King's Chamber, it is austere, bare, silent, and empty. No inscriptions, no gold, no sarcophagus worthy of a pharaoh. Just a granite box, a box too large to fit through the narrow passageways that lead to it, which means it was placed there during construction, before the walls went up, or perhaps before the pyramid itself was completed at all. The granite blocks that form the chamber were hauled from Aswan, some 500 miles away. They're composed of rose granite, dense and rich in quartz. and they rest inside a room whose dimensions, shape, and angles are mathematically precise. But it isn't just geometry that sets this room apart. It's sound. Researchers have long noted that when someone speaks or hums inside the king's chamber, the room responds. A low, vibrating hum builds, sometimes echoing at frequencies not even audible to the human ear, but perceptible in the chest. A sensation more than a sound. In 1995, acoustic engineer Tom Danley conducted studies inside the pyramid. His findings: the chamber resonates naturally at multiple frequencies, many of which correspond to the harmonic overtone series used in sacred music traditions. Most notably, the room resonates strongly at 432 Hertz, a frequency long considered spiritually significant by mystics and sound healers. Coincidence again? Possibly. But Danley also discovered that the shape and material of the chamber amplify this resonance. The granite's quartz crystals react to pressure and vibration, generating faint electrical charges. This effect is called piezoelectricity, and it's no fringe science. Quartz has long been used in electronics, from watches to radios, because of its ability to generate and receive frequency. So what happens when you place tons of quartz-rich stone in a precisely shaped chamber, inside a structure aligned to true north, on a geodetically active point of the Earth? Some believe you get a machine, not one with gears or circuits, but one that interacts with sound, with vibration, with frequency. Was the king's chamber designed to be played? Several researchers, including Christopher Dunn, an engineer who spent decades studying ancient precision, have suggested the chamber was part of an energy generation system, a resonator, not a tomb. He posits that the grand gallery acted like a waveguide, channeling sound or vibration upward into the chamber. Beneath the pyramid is a well shaft, which may have once connected to flowing water. Flowing water generates vibration, and when funneled through stone, it can create standing waves. Could the pyramid have captured that energy, concentrated it, transmitted it? It sounds like science fiction, until you remember that we already do similar things. Cathedrals and temples are designed with acoustics in mind. Bell towers, pipe organs, and Tibetan singing bowls all manipulate space and frequency to amplify sound. Why not the ancients? Especially if they understood sound not merely as sensation, but as force. Ancient Egyptian myths speak of creation by voice. The god Ptah spoke the world into being. The concept of sound as power permeates early religion. Even in Genesis, God's first act is vocal. Let there be light. Was this symbolic, or an echo of something literal? In the Temple of Hathor at Dendera, carvings show figures holding devices that look suspiciously like tuning forks. Some researchers interpret them as symbolic of sound healing. Others believe they hint at sonic tools used in construction. And what of the sonic levitation stories passed down through the Himalayas and Andes? Tales of stones floating in the air when bombarded with chanting and horns tuned to specific notes. Dismissed as legend, filed under impossibility. But what if the ancients were experimenting with resonance? Modern studies show that intense sound frequencies can cause physical objects to vibrate. Some frequencies can even displace small particles. It's not magic, it's physics. The Great Pyramid, then, may have been more than a tomb or a monument. It may have been an instrument, a harmonic temple, a generator. But for what purpose? Some speculate healing. Others, communication with the stars, with the divine, with memory. Still others whisper that the pyramids could be part of a global system, resonating not just with local energies, but with each other. A planetary grid humming just below perception. That theory is impossible to prove. And yet, when you stand inside the king's chamber and sing a single note, you feel it. The room awakens. Not loud, not dramatic, but ancient. And in that moment, surrounded by silent stone, the question surfaces again. Was this chamber built for the dead? Or for something still alive? For all the grandeur of the Great Pyramid, there is only one piece of physical evidence linking it to Pharaoh Khufu. Just one. It isn't a statue. It isn't an inscription on the outside of the monument. It isn't even an official royal decree. It's a name, written in red paint, tucked away in a crawl space few have ever seen. This is the infamous cartouche of Khufu, located in one of the small relieving chambers above the king's chamber, first accessed in the 19th century by Colonel Howard Weiss. According to Egyptology, this name confirms the builder of the Great Pyramid. Case closed, but the story of its discovery is murky, and the debate that surrounds it is anything but settled. In 1837, Weiss, a British military officer with no formal training in archaeology, was in a race to make his mark on Egyptian history. He had competition, Giovanni Caviglia, an explorer already excavating the pyramids. Under pressure, Weiss took drastic measures. He used gunpowder to blast his way into the hidden chambers above the king's chamber. What he found, or claimed to find, was staggering. Several painted hieroglyphs, including a royal cartouche spelling out Khufu's name. But here's where things unravel. The cartouche appears clumsily written, with mistakes in hieroglyphic syntax. It doesn't match other known royal inscriptions. And more strangely still, some letters appear to be in styles used during Weiss's own time, not the Fourth Dynasty. Modern researchers like Zechariah Sitchin and Scott Crichton have suggested that the cartouche was a forgery, a hasty, clumsy attempt by Weiss, or someone on his team, to cement his name in archaeological history. They point to Weiss's journal, which contains discrepancies. In early entries, there is no mention of finding Khufu's name. Then, suddenly, the entry appears, inserted later in different handwriting. Could it be that the most critical piece of evidence tying the pyramid to Khufu was fabricated? Egyptologists defend the cartouche, arguing that the red paint and style are consistent with workmen's marks found in other Old Kingdom structures. They dismiss the claims of forgery as conspiracy, but it raises a disturbing question. If this is the only direct reference to Khufu inside the pyramid, and that reference is in doubt, then what are we basing the attribution on? Not structure, not content, not even burial. There is no body inside the Great Pyramid, no grave goods, no funerary texts. Khufu's supposed sarcophagus in the king's chamber is a plain, lidless granite box. Too large to fit through the narrow ascending passages, it must have been placed during construction. But even that has never held a trace of human remains. Tombs, by nature, are filled with reverence, symbols, rituals, offerings. The Great Pyramid is silent. Even the causeways and temples surrounding the pyramid show only ambiguous links to Khufu. Some statues of him have been found elsewhere, but none in the pyramid complex itself. And the Herodotus account? Written 2,000 years after the fact, based on hearsay. He even claims that the pyramid took 20 years to build and that onions and garlic were among the workers' rations. Details hardly befitting a structure of sacred cosmic alignment. So why do we cling to Khufu? Some say it's academic inertia. Others a need to tie the pyramid to a human hand, any human hand, rather than entertain the possibility of lost technology or forgotten timelines. If the cartouche were to be definitively proven false, the consequences would be seismic. The dating of the pyramid would collapse. The identity of its builder would vanish, and we would be left with a 6-million-ton enigma with no name. That might be more terrifying than admitting the truth. Because if Khufu didn't build it, then who did? And more importantly, why? The Great Pyramid could then be seen not as a royal tomb, but as an inheritance. A relic passed down to dynasties who could not understand its origin, only honor it. The missing context would become the real mystery. And the cartouche, faint, fragile, isolated, would stand not as evidence, but as a monument to our desperation to explain the inexplicable. We will now follow this thread further toward a forbidden relic that casts an even deeper shadow on official history. A stone tablet that most historians prefer you never see. In a quiet corner of the Cairo Museum sits a relic most visitors pass without notice. It's not grand. It's cracked, partially broken, and modest in size. Yet for those who know what they're looking at, it's a time bomb. This is the Inventory Stela, sometimes called the Stela of the daughter of Khufu. And if its contents are taken seriously, the entire timeline of Egyptian history must be rewritten. Carved in the 26th dynasty, some 2,000 years after the supposed construction of the Great Pyramid, the Stela recounts a curious event. It states that Pharaoh Khufu came upon a temple dedicated to Isis near the Sphinx. It says the Sphinx and the temple already existed in his time. And more shockingly, it mentions the House of Osiris, Lord of Rostau, a clear reference to the Great Pyramid. If the Sphinx and pyramid existed before Khufu, then Khufu did not build them, he restored them. This single tablet quietly undermines the core of Egyptology. The narrative that Khufu designed, engineered, and erected the Great Pyramid over a 20-year span begins to wither under the weight of this overlooked stone. So why isn't the Inventory Stela famous? Because Egyptologists call it unreliable. They claim it's pseudo-history, a fabrication created by later priests to legitimize their religious authority. They say the stela confuses fact and myth, and that its references to Isis and Osiris are anachronistic. Yet in other cases, such stelae are treated with reverence, used to reconstruct events, timelines, and political alliances. Why is this one different? Perhaps because it introduces an inconvenient idea that Khufu, the central figure around whom Egypt's most iconic structure revolves, was not the builder, but merely a caretaker. A ruler who inherited sacred structures so old that their origins were already fading into legend. This is not an isolated instance. Other inscriptions and oral traditions from across Egypt speak of ruins and relics from before the time of the pharaohs. The priests of Heliopolis told Herodotus that Egypt had passed through multiple cataclysms, that the Nile had changed course, that temples had been rebuilt time and again. The implication: Egypt was not the beginning of civilization. It was the rebuilding of one. The Inventory Stela supports this possibility. It names the goddess Isis as having a temple near the Sphinx, long before Khufu's reign. It implies that the area was already sacred, already built upon, and already tied to the divine. And more than that, the language of the stela carries reverence, not triumph, not conquest. Khufu doesn't boast about creating new wonders. He gives offerings to what was already ancient. This pattern of pharaohs claiming to restore or honor pre-existing sites appears again and again in Egyptian history. Seti the Ramses II, Thutmose III. All carve their names over older ruins. They didn't build them, they adopted them. And yet we continue to assign the pyramids to Khufu based on one disputed cartouche and little else. The Inventory Stela whispers something different. That the Great Pyramid was old, already venerable, when Khufu walked its corridors. That the Sphinx had already lost part of its nose. That the House of Osiris stood as a relic, not a project. But if this is true, then everything changes. Our understanding of dynastic Egypt becomes a sequel, not a genesis. Our timelines collapse backward into a past we cannot chart. And the Great Pyramid becomes not a pinnacle, but a vestige. Some Egyptologists have suggested hiding or discrediting such artifacts preserves the integrity of history. But what is history without its inconvenient truths? The Inventory Stela does not shout. It doesn't claim thunder or miracles. It simply suggests, look again. Look beyond the narrative, beyond the dynasty, beyond the desert. Because the real builders, the ones Khufu honored, may not have been Egyptian at all. They may have been something else. Older than pharaohs, older than myth, almost forgotten. In the next section, we widen the lens. From Egypt to the world, and we ask the question few dare to speak aloud. Why do pyramids appear everywhere? From the flat plains of Giza to the steamy jungles of Guatemala, from the Chinese heartlands to the Mississippi River Valley. One shape emerges again and again, timeless, unyielding, unmistakable. The pyramid. It's a design so mathematically elegant, so structurally sound, that it has surfaced in almost every corner of the ancient world. And yet, how? How did cultures separated by oceans, languages, and millennia all arrive at the same architectural solution? Mainstream archaeologists argue the answer is simple: convergent evolution. The pyramid is a natural form for stacking materials. Its shape is stable, easy to build upward, a solution that civilizations would naturally invent on their own. But not all pyramids are equal. Some are made of mud bricks, others of megalithic stone. Some are stepped, others smooth. Some align with the stars, others with the seasons. But the pattern remains. In Teotihuacan, Mexico, the Pyramid of the Sun sits in alignment with astronomical events, mirroring the solar orientations of Egyptian monuments. Its base is nearly the same size as the Great Pyramid. Coincidence? In China's Shanxi province, satellite imagery reveals dozens of ancient pyramidal mounds, some overgrown, some deliberately hidden from public view. Chinese authorities have acknowledged their existence, but have not allowed full excavation. Why the secrecy? The Chinese pyramids, especially the massive White Pyramid, reportedly seen by American pilots during World War II, are said to dwarf Giza's in scale. And yet, they remain outside the global conversation. In Sudan, just south of Egypt, the Nubian pyramids of Meroe stand tall and sharp, more numerous than their northern cousins. Built by the Kingdom of Kush, they appear centuries after Egypt's decline, but are almost spiritual continuations. And then there are the mounds. In North America, the Cahokia Mounds near St. Louis once supported a city larger than London in the 11th century. Its central pyramid-like mound aligns with lunar events, and its layout suggests sacred geometry. The Inca, the Maya, the Olmec, all built pyramidal temples. The Sumerians, long before them, constructed ziggurats. Everywhere, we find the same concept: a raised platform, a sacred summit, a stairway to the heavens. Was this coincidence or communication? Fringe theorists offer a provocative idea. that an ancient, global civilization once spanned continents. Not in the way we imagine empires, but as a network of knowledge. Shared symbols, shared cosmologies. They point to pyramid alignments that echo across time zones, to legends of culture bringers arriving from the sea, bearded, cloaked, star-guided. In Mesoamerica, they are called Quetzalcoatl. In Egypt, Thoth. In Sumer, Owens. Messengers, teachers, builders. These myths persist not as tales, but as echoes, refrains that appear again and again from vastly different people who never knew one another. Unless the world was not as disconnected as we think. The pyramids may have functioned as more than temples or tombs. Some researchers believe they were geodetic markers, nodes in a planetary energy grid, a global system based on geometry, frequency, and resonance. Consider this. The Great Pyramid's location is no accident. It lies at the intersection of the longest line of latitude and the longest line of longitude that cross land. In other words, it is the most central landmass point on Earth. Its placement reflects an understanding of planetary geometry that should have been beyond its time. Similar claims are made of Angkor Wat in Cambodia, Machu Picchu in Peru, and Göbekli Tepe in Turkey. Sites placed with impossible precision. Were these sites part of a global knowledge system? Mainstream science rejects the idea. There is no evidence, they say, of cultural diffusion on that scale. No boats, no maps, no tools. But what if the evidence is buried? Beneath cities, beneath jungles, beneath water, or worse? What if it has been deliberately hidden? The recurring presence of pyramids might be more than architectural convenience. It might be a memory, a signature, a message left by civilization we no longer recognize. One that knew the stars, that felt the hum of the earth, that built not to impress, but to align. The Great Pyramid may be the most famous, but it is not alone. It is part of something vast, something forgotten. And as we trace this web from continent to continent, we begin to see the outline of a lost world, one whose fingerprints remain etched in stone. Even as its name fades into dust, there is a paradox in the sand, and it begins not with stone, but with bone. Archaeologists have long used skeletal remains to reconstruct the lives of ancient peoples, what they ate, how they worked, what diseases they carried. But at Giza, and across many pyramid sites worldwide, the evidence creates a troubling contrast. The bones found near these megalithic structures often tell a story of hardship, malnourishment, crude tools, short lifespans. They do not match the grandeur of the stones above them. This gap, the disconnect between builder and burial, grows wider the deeper we look. Near the Great Pyramid, workers' graves have been discovered. Egyptologists celebrate these findings as proof that the pyramids were built by skilled laborers, not slaves. These workers were honored in death, buried with beer jars and bread offerings. But their remains show signs of severe physical stress. Herniated discs, smashed bones, repetitive strain. Their vertebrae whisper of carts pushed, of stone dragged. Hard labor. No mystery there. But here's where the silence deepens. These workers, however noble their efforts, could not have designed what they built. They were not engineers. They left no plans, no blueprints, no evidence of understanding the structure's internal architecture. And this raises a chilling possibility. Were they even building at all? Or were they maintaining something already ancient? Restoring fallen stones, recarving lost names, keeping a monument alive, not creating it from scratch. We see this pattern elsewhere. At Baalbek in Lebanon, the foundation stones of the Temple of Jupiter, some weighing over 800 tons, are far larger than anything the Romans ever built atop them. The Roman temple is ornate, sure, but the platform? Monolithic, rough, mysterious, no tools found, no quarries nearby, no records. At Ollantaytambo in Peru, the Inca built terraces and walls atop a foundation of massive, interlocking stones that defy explanation. The joints are perfect, the shapes complex. Later, Incan stonework is crude by comparison. So we ask, did these civilizations inherit their greatest monuments? And did they settle near them, drawn not by water or land, but by memory? Back at Giza, the megalithic elements, those that form the base layers, the hidden passages, the core blocks, are far more precise than the additions built later. The deeper you go, the older the stones, the finer the craft. This is not how history usually works. Technologies evolve upward, from crude to refined, from trial to mastery. But here, we see the opposite. Some researchers describe this as the inverted pyramid of progress, as if something once known has been slowly forgotten, not lost in fire or war, but eroded one lifetime at a time. And the bones? They remain silent. The people buried around these sites lived hard, short lives. Their diets were poor. Their tools were simple. They were not the architects. So who were they? Caretakers, colonists, survivors? Or were they simply trying to understand what stood before them, just as we are now? There are even older bones. In 2017, archaeologists in Africa unearthed skeletal remains of anatomically modern humans dated over 300,000 years old. But there is a void in the archaeological record, hundreds of thousands of years with almost no evidence of complex architecture, writing, or astronomy. Some believe that's because it didn't exist. Others suggest we've been looking in the wrong places, or not looking at all. Because if a civilization once flourished, perhaps pre-Ice Age, perhaps coastal, it would have been swallowed by the rising seas. Over 10 million square kilometers of ancient shoreline now lies underwater. Whatever stood there, if anything, is lost or deliberately ignored. And if such a civilization did exist, one capable of harnessing stone and sound, of aligning temples with stars, then those we find buried in the sand are not its builders, but its witnesses, echoes of a world half remembered, caretakers of monuments they could not explain, bones beneath stones. The deeper the mystery, the harder the questions. Because if the builders were not the Egyptians, not the Inca, not the Greeks or the Romans, then who or what was? We are left with the ruins, advanced, mysterious, alone, and the skeletons beside them, whispering in their silence. We lived here once, but this was never ours, long before the name Egypt ever appeared on a map, long before the Nile was tamed and the first pharaoh crowned. A story was carved, not in stone, but in clay. Thousands of miles to the east, in ancient Mesopotamia, scribes pressed wedge-shaped symbols into damp tablets, recording myths, laws, histories, and something stranger, the tales of the Anunnaki. To mainstream historians, the Anunnaki were gods of the Sumerian pantheon, deities associated with sky and earth, heaven and the underworld. But in the fringe world of alternative archaeology, the Anunnaki are something else entirely. Not gods, but visitors, beings who came from the heavens to the earth, as the tablets say, not metaphorically, literally. According to these ancient texts, particularly the Enuma Elish and Atrahasis epics, the Anunnaki were beings of immense power and knowledge. They descended from a planet called Nibiru, seeking resources, particularly gold. and in the course of their long mission on Earth, they created humanity. Created, not in spirit, but through manipulation, engineering, genetics, the Nephilim of the Bible, the Watchers of Enoch, the Shining Ones of Egypt. Different names, same echoes. But where do the pyramids fit in? Researchers like Zecharia Sitchin, controversial and often dismissed, argued that the pyramids were not tombs, but landing markers, energy beacons, navigational tools used by the Anunnaki to triangulate planetary alignments and perhaps even interstellar pathways. He pointed to the alignment of the pyramids with Orion's belt, not as coincidence, but as calibration. The Great Pyramid, with its precise angles and geodetic placement, could have been part of a global grid, a system of power or communication that spanned the planet. Others expand on this. They argue the pyramids functioned as resonators, working in tandem with natural frequencies to transmit data, sustain energy fields, or alter consciousness. Crazy? Perhaps. But consider this. The Sumerians had detailed knowledge of celestial mechanics. They described planets that had not yet been discovered by modern astronomy. Their cylinder seals depict the solar system with astonishing accuracy. And their gods, the Anunnaki, were depicted not as omnipotent spirits, but as flesh and blood beings. Powerful, yes, but with personalities, families, hierarchies. In some seals, they wear watch-like devices, helmets, breathing apparatuses, artistic flourishes, or fossilized memory. If the Anunnaki did exist, and if they were real, then Egypt could have been one of their strongholds. In fact, some of the earliest Egyptian gods bear uncanny similarities to their Mesopotamian counterparts. Enki, the god of water and knowledge, mirrors Thoth. Enlil, the storm god, shares traits with Set. Inanna, queen of heaven, becomes Hathor or Isis. Myths merge, forms shift, but the story lingers. A story of beings who descended, shaped civilizations, and then vanished or retreated. The Zep Tepi of Egypt, the first time, describes an era when gods ruled directly over mankind, when the Nile was new and the stars were close. Could this be a retelling of the Anunnaki epoch? If so, the pyramids may not be mere tombs or temples. They could be evidence of a forgotten age, one in which Earth was not alone and humans were not yet in control. We see tantalizing hints of this in the Book of Enoch, where angels descend and teach forbidden knowledge, metallurgy, weaponry, and the secrets of heaven. The Watchers build cities, they father giants, and they are punished, flooded, buried, erased. Sound familiar? Perhaps the builders of the pyramids were not human in the way we understand it. Perhaps they were hybrid, or trained, or tasked. Some have even proposed that the Great Pyramid is a remnant, not just of ancient genius, but of extraterrestrial legacy. A monument that cannot be decoded by linear history. A message in frequency, in stone, in time. And perhaps the Anunnaki never truly left. Perhaps they watch from orbit, or sleep beneath the sand, or whisper still in myths we dare not take literally. So we ask, are the pyramids our achievement, or our inheritance? In the next section, we follow this question into the shadows, toward vaults of silence, archives of secrecy, where whispers of pre-flood civilizations linger, behind locked doors. In the heart of Rome, beyond the marble colonnades of St. Peter's Basilica, beneath the hushed corridors of the Apostolic Palace, lies one of the most secretive archives on Earth, the Vatican Apostolic Archive. It stretches over 50 miles of shelving, filled with scrolls, letters, decrees, and manuscripts. Some so ancient, their ink has become part of the parchment. Most people know only its name. Fewer still know its contents, and even fewer have ever walked its corridors. For centuries, the Catholic Church has collected, copied, and locked away documents from every corner of human civilization. It's not a conspiracy. It's policy. Preservation through secrecy. But among the preserved papal bulls and royal confessions, there are rumors of something older. Papyri recovered from Egyptian tombs, cuneiform tablets sent from Baghdad during the Crusades, Gnostic texts deemed heretical, hidden away instead of burned. And beneath it all, stories. Stories of the pre-Adamic world, of a civilization before the flood, of knowledge not meant for man. Some believe that early Christian scholars, while translating ancient texts into Latin and Greek, discovered references to star beings, sky temples, and fallen angels who gave mankind architecture, metallurgy, and mathematics. And rather than publish these findings, they suppressed them, not out of malice, but out of fear. What would happen to the foundation of belief if it were revealed that the pyramids, monuments often older than the biblical timeline allows, were not human creations? Or worse, that they were built with the aid of those once called gods. In 1582, Jesuit scholar Athanasius Kircher published Oedipus Aegyptiacus, claiming that ancient Egyptian monuments preserved the primordial language given by divine beings. He was dismissed as mystical, but his access to Vatican texts raised questions. Why was the Church so invested in the mysteries of Egypt? Because perhaps they knew something. Records suggest that early popes sent agents to Alexandria after the library burned, not to mourn its loss, but to collect what had survived, to salvage scrolls, transport codices. And where were they taken? Not to the public, not to scholars, to the vaults. Among the whispers are mentions of a scroll called the Chronicle of the Seven Lights, describing a time when stone burned with music and the sky opened for those who knew the numbers. It allegedly details a global system of temples and pyramids used to commune with the heavens. Another rumored document, the Testament of Teba, speaks of a vault beneath Giza that houses the remains of the first ones, buried not in flesh, but in crystal and resonance. No such documents are available, not even for scholars with credentials, because the Vatican, despite occasional transparency, retains full authority to withhold access to materials it deems sensitive. And sensitive has many meanings. There are reports from archivists turned whistleblowers of rooms sealed behind iron gates, of maps showing ancient cities now lost to the sea, and even of translated tablets that predate both Egypt and Sumer. In these stories, one theme returns again and again. The flood did not wash everything away. Some things were hidden, some things were kept. And while the pyramids remain visible to the world, their context, what they truly were, may reside not in Egypt, but in Vatican vaults. It is ironic that the key to unlocking one of the greatest architectural mysteries on earth might sit beneath a cathedral, not in the sand, but in the silence. Yet perhaps this is appropriate, because if the pyramids are messages carved in stone and coded in geometry, then perhaps the vaults are their echo, a library of answers locked behind belief. And if one day those doors ever open, what might we learn? That the builders came from the stars, that Egypt was not the beginning, but a colony, that the gods walked among us and left blueprints behind? Or perhaps the truth is simpler. Perhaps the Church, like the pharaohs before them, merely inherited what others had hidden. Guardians, not deceivers. But until the keys turn, we are left to guess, to study stone in place of scripture, and to wonder what truths remain sealed, not beneath sand, but beneath Rome.